So, welcome everyone to the 11th TEK Talk. It's really the bonus TEK Talk. It is our last one. And it's on allyship in research. And so we have 5 different researchers joining us to talk about it. And so first I want to start with a land acknowledgement. This is from University of Alaska Fairbanks through GIGSA, the GI Graduate Student Association. So I want to recognize that the University of Alaska Fairbanks is on the traditional lands of the Lower Dene. The campus the hill it's on is Trothieta. And we like to recognize their environmental stewardship, as well as the works and the knowledge that have been from Indigenous people for a long time. And I think this panel is kind of rooted in that, and how do we honor that knowledge, and how do we honor Indigenous people and the work that they do in our work and our research. And so with that, I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. And in my little grid here, Henry is first.
Thanks, Margaret. I'm Henry Huntington. I'm calling in from Denying the Land in the Eagle River. I have been doing research of various kinds in Alaska since 1988, and the old thing: the more I learn, the more I realize how much I have yet to learn. So I'm looking forward to the panel and to learning a lot here.
Thank you. Next, I have Courtney.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Courtney Carothers, also calling in from Dena'ina Lands in Anchorage. And I'm, really excited for this panel, Margaret and Anika. Just want to start with a real appreciation for you both to leading this amazing series all semester, and just so proud to be invited to join for this session. And my ancestry is Irish and English. I come from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a working class steel mill family. My training's in environmental anthropology, but I've really kind of shifted more into trying to think more about decolonizing science practice. I work a lot in fisheries systems. I'm a professor of fisheries at UAF. Really excited to join the panel. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And the next I have Mike.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this panel, and thanks for setting it up, Margaret, especially the last, few years. I know that you've been running this, and this is really an outstanding series. I hear excellent words about it from far beyond the university, so I'm really glad that you guys are doing this. My name is Mike Koskey. I work with the Indigenous Studies Master's and PhD programs at the Center of Cross-Cultural Studies here in Fairbanks, Alaska, at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And most of my background has been in ethnohistory, culture change, resource allocation and management, and so forth, and always within a context of decolonization and indigenization. And I've been privileged to be able to work with the Indigenous programs here at UAF since 2007. So that's been the greatest education of my life, I have to say. And I'm really, again, honored to be here with you all today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And I also want to recognize that you teach traditional ecological knowledge, the course at UAF, which we kind of stole the name from for this lecture series and TEK Talks and stuff.
It's okay.
And the concept.
And I teach that with Teresa John, just to be fair.
And Carrie Stevens.
Carrie Stevens, Sauza, Sakunt Ben Stevens, Bauza, Sedana Hechdia Drachi, Bauza, Maryland Hudson, Dini Hutana Hudson, Fairbanks Lesdo, Ita Albert Subik Bauza, Ina Patricia Subik Bauza, Maryland Lida. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Stevens, and I'm faculty here in the Tribal Governance Program at UAF on the Trothieta campus, the homelands of the Chinahutani people. I introduced myself in Danaka. I am a white settler from Maryland, and my husband and his family are from Stevens Village, and my son on the Yukon River, and they are the people of the canyon, Dini Hutana. I introduced myself in their language, the Danaka language. With my white privilege comes the privilege of learning my son's and my husband's Indigenous language without trauma, which is something that is really carried in this place, is that those that are with us who lived through the boarding school era, and the grandparents that are teaching us suffer great trauma just for speaking their language on their homelands here. And so I just acknowledge that in my introduction. I am a faculty of tribal governance, as I mentioned, and I am also, for all of you who know me and those who are getting to know me, a diehard advocate of tribal sovereignty, of uplifting the governance systems of Indigenous peoples as the solution to the problems which we face today: climate change, oppression, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy. And we must uplift these Indigenous systems of governance and be willing to do so as allies. And I come humbly here today. I feel like it is our job and our work as white settlers to dismantle these systems of oppression and of racism directly and head on. And these are uncomfortable situations and conversations for many. And if you're not having an uncomfortable conversation, you're not having the conversation that needs to be had. So, Anabasi.
Thanks. And last but not least, Anika, who's also the co-host of this series.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us to our last one of the TEK Talks for this season. And yeah, I'm happy to be here. I am, or many of you probably know me, I'm a second-year graduate student at UAF. I am originally from Germany, from a small town called Schwabach. It's in Middle Franconia, so that's my home region in Bavaria, in southern Germany. And I came here to study snow, and I did learn a lot about coming from a very different background and coming to the US. I did learn a lot about working in this Indigenous context and living on Indigenous land. And so I'm still learning a lot, and that's probably gonna be continuous throughout my life. I'm very happy. Yeah, so I'm here to learn, and I would love to share that with you. And so I'm really excited for our conversation here today. And thanks to our panelists for joining. And I'll hand it over to Margaret.
Thank you. So we're going to open up the discussion with allyship is a difficult concept. And so we wanted to open up this discussion on the concept of it and your perspectives. And so does someone want to start us out?
Okay, I'll dive in if no one else
Okay.
will. Yeah, it's troublesome if you look at much of the literature about cross-cultural, cross-racial, interracial, other relations, and so on. There's plenty of critique of the term allyship and so on, and suggestions for other ones. I think, to me, a lot of the problem comes with who's making the claim and what are they basing that claim on. If I'm proclaiming myself as an ally and saying, hey, look at me, I'm one of the good guys, that's based on what I think of myself and sort of what I think my attitudes are. That's really not much of a basis for claiming anything. Other things that, if the people that I would like to be allies with are recognizing me as an ally, that may be a little bit different, but that's not up to me to say that. The other question is, are we saying, well, it's based on thinking the right thoughts? Okay, that's important. We don't want to be thinking wrong thoughts, but is it also based on the actions we take? Hey, I'm one of the good guys. I don't actually do anything, but trust me, I'm one of the good guys. Again, not very convincing. So what do we actually, regardless of what term we use, what's our basis for that? And are we looking, and as Carrie said, are we taking that hard look at what we're doing and willing to be uncomfortable and saying, I'm really falling short in some areas, or are we sort of papering it over and saying, oh, come on, I'm on Dena'ina land, I'm a nice neighbor, so we're good. That's insufficient. So what are we willing to do to express whatever we want to call this to express our put our values into practice.
Well, I guess I'll follow up then. Thanks, Henry. And this is Mike. And I fully agree with what Henry's saying. And I think that the main thing, of course, is just to be genuine in our intentions and genuine in our actions. If we are genuinely involved in the same concerns, addressing the same problems, the same challenges, then I think that that helps to build trust. But of course, again, it has to be a genuine commitment of putting the community first, before ourselves, before our research, before any of those things. And I think that by being constantly and truthfully introspective, I think it's a helpful way to check ourselves and to make sure that we are not maybe responding and reacting in ways for selfish reasons, but instead for the greater good of the communities that we're working with and the people who make up those communities. So I think that that's a large part of it, is genuine intent and being open and willing to make changes and move at a pace that's reasonable for the community. I always say, and I hold to this, that if a community ever decides that the research that we're doing is no longer appropriate or relevant, that we stop it with no problems, with no questions, and we work together to figure out how to make the effort go on. And so I think it's one of openness and inclusion, but also self-honesty, so that we can be genuine when we're working within other communities. Thanks.
I can chime in next, if that's okay, Anika and Carrie. Yeah, just to, I was reflecting on, the invitation and was like so thrilled, Margaret and Anika, like I said, as graduate students, to be creating this space and uplifting the kind of discussion that you have over these years. It's just so impressive. And so I instantly was like, I'd love to come. Thank you so much for the invitation. And then was reflecting a bit more though on this fraught nature of allyship and also centering whiteness, in this discussion and centering ourselves. I think a lot of us in this space are uncomfortable doing that and have gotten direct guidance that that's not kind of what's needed at this time. But also we do have a ton of privilege, and thinking about how we can wield that. I think about that a lot in my work as a tenured faculty member, in a department. How can I help facilitate change? And thinking again about this kind of allyship, I guess what I wanted to share in opening is being trained in a discipline like cultural anthropology that I think, I don't really identify with that discipline so much and haven't for a while. So I don't want to sort of, I'm not currently in the debate and discussion, but when I was learning about anthropology in the early 2000s, the discipline had this sense of its colonial past and the sort of reflexivity that happened in the 80s and 90s and post-structuralism and knowledge power and all of this like transformation within the discipline. And yet every faculty member I had was white. Most of them were men. Every one in the canon that we read, with the exception of a couple of women, were white men. All of these concepts that I was taught about how to think about power and deconstructing research and all of this was still European. It was still Eurocentric. And it's taken me a long time to sort of understand how that is white supremacy, how that is, deeply ingrained kind of within our own selves, but within our institutions, that is what we're trying to react against, and being able to sort of understand that research is kind of perpetuating that. And so how do we do something pretty radically different, really transform research, like not to research, but to action, right? Because the kind of oppression, the kind of violence, the kind of systems that we're operating in are brutally oppressive for people that aren't white. And as a white person, I think it's, sometimes I have this sense of like, I need to do more learning. I need to think about how to say all this right. I want to make sure I understand the academics of allyship. It's like, no, I don't. I'm learning, I'm unlearning, I'm a novice, I'm not an expert, I'm a mess at this, but it's absolutely important that those of us in these systems are doing everything we can do to move forward, to do action, to get past the systems that are like literally oppressing, killing, making violence against, Black and brown people. And it's just, anyway, I'm just saying that the kind of like uncomfort that I feel is also tempered with this sense of urgency, I think, that many of us feel in this 2021 space. So thank you for listening.
Basi, I could add, I also want to give again a big Basi, a thank you to Margaret and Anika for hosting these dialogues and for creating this space. I'm sorry I didn't do that earlier. I think for myself, I'm always having favorite quotes with me, and Lila Watson is Aboriginal thinker, an amazing woman, and one of the most notable quotes related to allyship is hers, and she says, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, let us work together." And I think that for me, it is very hard to discuss allyship and center myself as a white woman. And my work is of decentering myself and decentering the white narrative and utilizing white privilege to do so. I am a novice in this work. I am only just learning and beginning. I'm a student of trying to do things in a good way. And it is always a rub and a push for me as white faculty in tribal governance. And so I am always messing up, and I am always learning and trying to do my best. And so I feel that we need to move from allies to accomplices, and that saying that you don't have the experience or knowledge to do so is the easiest road out. None of us have that knowledge until we've engaged in doing the work of making ourselves uncomfortable, decentering ourselves, and using our voice. And specifically in the realm of research and of academia is, do you use your voice? Do you use your work to dismantle systems of oppression, of racism, and of colonization here within our own institution? That is not only the job of our Indigenous faculty, our Indigenous staff, tribal leaders. It is the work of white faculty, white staff, white scholars. We see our Indigenous faculty inundated with multiple committees and task forces to address diversity, inclusion, civil rights, decolonization, indigeneity. And this is not their work alone. It's exhausting. I see our colleagues constantly tapped out and burdened yet again with their own oppression. And so it is upon us to speak to these truths, to own our privilege, and to, as Courtney said, create action. And so for myself, I'm not heavy in research, but is that coming back to the quote and some of the work that we've done in philanthropy is that philanthropy is yet again a system of colonization and of white privilege telling communities of color how to solve their problems. So I ask you, in your research, who is posing the questions? Who is posing the solutions? Are you willing to give up space, power, resources, funding, time? Is there equity in that work for those people that you are engaging with? Because by and large, I am the student. I am the one who is constantly learning and benefiting from Indigenous knowledge, tribal governance, and others. So I just have to say big anabasi to all of the tribal leaders who have taught me.
Yeah, maybe I'll chime in. I try to hold back a little bit as co-host of the series, but yeah, you've touched on many of the different aspects of what Margaret and I have discussed when Margaret brought up that when we were planning the series and when we were inviting speakers and choosing topics, really what was missing was, yeah, how can we as white people, or yeah, me in terms of really me and not Margaret, but how can we put those good thoughts and the willingness of wanting to do better into action, and how can we really translate it, and what's the role of an ally. And Margaret and I, just as well as yeah, everyone else here on the panel is very well aware of this meaning of the word allyship, and that in how it's not perfect, just as we choose a name for the TEK Talks that's also not by any means perfect. But yeah, we really wanted to, people can identify with the word allyship and they know it. And so we really chose it to kind of touch upon all these different aspects that are important to consider. And so when we asked all of you to join, like I was very torn and like, well, how do we do this? How do we organize it? Like, can I be on the panel? Should I be? I don't want to be. And how do we do this? And so I feel like this struggle of how do I do things, and my positionality, sort of figuring out how do I relate to what's my position in my work, what's my personal position, what's my position within the systems I'm in. So me as a student, I'm in my working group, but then I'm part of the university, I'm part of a department. So where are the different levels at which like I can make change and I can ask for change, and what are my like capacities and capabilities, I think. And so thanks for touching on all these different aspects. And yeah, this was just to give a bit of background. Yeah, sort of even the struggle that we had planning this talk. So thanks everyone for joining and for listening in and for bringing up all these important topics. So thank you very much for speaking. Yeah.
I think a lot of you already touched on the next question, but if anyone wants to add how they're including allyship in their work, just anything, or else we can move on to the next question if no one has anything to add.
Well, you know, I just would like to add real quickly to follow up on what Anika was saying, because, and also Carrie, because, you know, really what it comes down to is recognizing ourselves as the learners and not the experts, to take the time to listen to what people have to say and to try to be able, I mean, part of being a scholar, right, is to be able to take different lines of information and to weave them together with the help of those around us into a narrative that reflects accurately the culture and the concerns and the perspectives and the worldviews of the people who we're working with. And that, of course, takes time, which takes patience, which itself is a reflection of respect. And so it takes self-control is what it takes, and learning how to change one's own behavior and expectations to correlate with those of the community. And I know we keep using this term allyship, and another term that's often used is collaborator, which has very negative sounds in a great part of the world. And so I avoid that term very much. But, you know, just working as partners, as equals, as two interested groups of people who recognize the common value of what we're trying to do. And I think that that, you know, is very, very important, especially if we come in with research money and the privilege that others were talking about, Courtney and Carrie, I think, and, you know, and recognize that this does change the situation on the ground. And therefore we have to be able to change and manipulate the situation of our own condition to try to make that balance possible in the community. And by balance, I mean influence on the project and then vice versa, the project's influence back out. And so I think that, you know, the terms aren't so important. It's the behavior that matters everything, and how we are, how we carry ourselves, what we value, and whether we're putting the well-being of the community ahead of our own professional and personal interests. It has to be first. Otherwise, we're working for ourselves first. And that's not really, I think, the point of what a lot of us are trying to do in this sort of cross-cultural social work. Because after all, we're learning Indigenous knowledge from people who are willing to share it with us. So we're the learners and they're the teachers, the providers of the information. And no matter what degrees we have or don't have, that's the situation. And we have to recognize that that's our role. If we're going to be a partner, we are in a sense the second of equals, because we're learning from the community. The community is facilitating our capacity to learn and sharing that with us. Thanks.
So if I may, Margaret, really good points, but I think we also need to be very careful that we have no particular right to install ourselves as students. We can't go to somebody and say, I've decided you're going to be my teacher, and I'm going to be below you in the power structure, so we're good. I realize that's not what Carrie and Mike are saying, but I think it's worth emphasizing that this is like anything else, a consensual relationship. The people have to be willing to take that on, and some won't be. And as Mike said, our behavior there is to recognize, is to take no for an answer. People have often asked me for advice on working in Indigenous communities, and one of the things I often say is be willing to take no for an answer. You don't want the reputation as the person who comes in and is pushy and insists and says, "Oh, you said you didn't want to be interviewed, but I'll come back tomorrow. You'll change your mind." No. If somebody says no, they say no. End of discussion. But I think the other side of being a learner is being worth teaching. And there are many ways that you can do that. I mean, one is to be willing to learn, obviously. Talking to a brick wall is no fun for anybody, but it's also doing enough of your homework and preparation that you're ready. And I think that's been a lesson to me over the years, has been not to put that burden on other people to say, look, I don't know anything. I haven't bothered to learn about your community. Why don't you teach me? That's ridiculous. There's so much I can learn beforehand that I can come in and be actually worth talking to and be able to hold up my end of a conversation. In the chat, there's a discussion about the power relations and so on, and there too is something that I've learned over time. And initially, I would come into a community and think, here it is, just little old me, and I'm talking to a tribal council. They're a government. I'm little old me. And I'd failed to realize that the other dimensions of that power structure, which is I'm speaking in my language in which I've been trained. I have an education and all the credentials. I have access to funding and so on. I've got the research. All of these things that I come in that are on my side, and to then think that, well, this is an even discussion, or I'm the supplicant here. That may not be the way that the tribal council sees it. If you're used to having people who look like me coming in and telling you what to do, I'm just the latest, you fall into that habit. I'm just the latest avatar of colonialism. And if I don't recognize that, what am I bringing to this conversation?
I can chime in to follow that, Henry. Yeah, just that sort of researcher legacy, I think, is so important in understanding the context of research within Alaska and across the world, really, right? Where Western science has been really tightly linked to colonialism and some really bad science, right? I mean, all of the bunk race science, the whole kind of project of Western science to dehumanize non-white people, right? And that was connected to really a lot of colonial violence. And so one of these learnings that I am part of in my work here as a Western trained white person is recognizing research for many people has not been good or even benign, right? It's been highly violent. And I think Linda Tuiwa Smith, Dr. Smith's book on decolonizing methodologies starts out, maybe the full book or one of the chapters, with that research is one of the dirtiest words for Indigenous communities, and sort of recognizing as, it's our absolute responsibility as researchers to understand research legacy, and an ongoing practice as well, and really starting from a place of, I mean, in my research process, I'll just say I've kind of gone through this shift where I'm not really doing any research that I'm interested in this question, I want to figure it out, or I have, you know, some interesting, there's a gap in the literature, I'm gonna go look at that. I'm doing work in response to tribal partner and community requests. You know, we need some data to support this. We need something like this. And I do try in the kind of like fisheries research and policy realm to be able to supply some data streams, things that are often missed in the Western science realm. But I'm kind of not really doing any research that's not driven from communities at this point in my process.
So I think this is a good segue into a question that did come in the chat about speaking on your experience with grant funding, funders, and working with Indigenous communities. Have any of you had to navigate stopping or redirecting grant funds? And if so, can you speak to that?
Well, I guess I'll go ahead. I'll go ahead, Carrie, please.
I apologize, Mike. I can come to that from the tribal perspective, in that we had researchers when I was working for tribal governments suggest that the lights were on, but nobody was home. Suggests that tribes were not showing up. Suggests that Native people were not engaged. Fully insulting. And we had to address that head on. We had to have very strong conversations, make people uncomfortable, and call out their levels of funding, the tokenism and inclusion of the tribal governments, and ask them, if you want tribes and tribal governments to show up, are you funding them? Are you funding their participation at the level you're funding your own participation? Only then can you ask anyone to participate at that level. Tribes are often told this must not be an issue for them. They don't show up. Receiving zero funding or a $50 Fred Meyer gift card. And that's simply unacceptable. So we had them reallocate their funds to hire full-time tribal staff. And then the project moved forward. And this was in wood energy research in the Yukon Flats with the Council of Athabascan Tribal Governments. And it was not even thought of by the research partner, not even considered that this was an issue. And so I ask you, at what level and at what phase in your work is there relationship and inclusion of the tribal governments, of the tribal peoples of that place who live there, who will die there, who are buried there, who will give birth there? Are they informing the budget making process itself? Is there any equity in the funding dialogue? The funding, the work is built on the back of their knowledge, their lands, their stewardship, their family, and yet the funding at their level is tokenized. So I definitely, this is something that I'm always shouting from the rooftops. If you want to speak about allyship or being a good accomplice, what is the equity in the funding? Because it is money is power in our capitalist society, and it is often a very token expression, the level of the redistribution. And I've said two words, relationship and redistribution. And I have to thank Dr. Jessica Black. She has taught me so much. And one of the things that she introduced me to was LaDonna Harris in the 4 R's. And I very much encourage you just to look up LaDonna Harris's paper if you have not yet read it. And the 4 R's of indigeneity in the Indigenous worldview are reciprocity, redistribution, relationship, and responsibility. And you can ask yourself, have you integrated those 4 aspects into your research, and at what level? And that always includes funding. That always includes decision making. So again, that's LaDonna Harris. Thank you, Margaret. Margaret's just on top of it in the chat with lots of resources. But redistribution is a critical element in the work here. And are you willing to push against the funding systems themselves? Because this type of valuable research takes more time and more energy.
So a follow-up from, oh, Mike, if you read the chat, but it's about if the community no longer support or see the purpose of the research, stopping, readdressing the research, navigating funders, things of that sort. There's more there, but.
Well, yeah, I think that, thanks for the question too, Glenna. And I think that, you know, really when it comes to doing research prior to this sort of, okay, let me restart that. When I was doing research in Siberia in the 1990s, it was another world of research. And I learned, I think, like maybe Henry was saying, oftentimes the hard way, or one of you, maybe it wasn't Henry, sorry, by making mistakes, stumbling, and just moving on. And I think that unfortunately, that's the way a lot of this goes, especially when working with funding agencies. And when I was doing my field work for my PhD in the 1990s in Siberia, I had, unfortunately, I was basically captured, beat up, and robbed of my research money, or a portion of it. I had hid the rest of it elsewhere, and I had no idea how this would affect my research and my standing with National Science Foundation and so forth. But I have to say that they were very cooperative and understanding in helping us to resolve the situation. I managed to use the remaining research money to complete the project anyway, without the half that had been stolen from me. And I found through the process that even back in the 1990s, and that's quite some time ago, NSF was very willing to work with me to help me to readjust the budget to my situation. Years later, when I had to make a similar budget request, but this time because of changes in priorities in a community that I was working with, again, there were questions that were asked and so forth, but it was allowed to be repurposed. It was allowed to be readjusted, especially if I had support from the community that I was working with. And so what I've found, and increasingly so over the years, over the decades, is that these funding agencies recognize the ethical, even if they, let me put it another way, even if they don't necessarily recognize the ethical situation regarding funding and changing the use of funds within a project, they're willing to, I've found in my experience that they're willing to learn and they're willing to adjust as long as the explanation and the support is there. And increasingly, and especially in the past 10 years or so, I've found that funders very much want to know for sure that we as researchers are aware of what the communities want from the research itself, what they expect from it, and what's considered reasonable regarding compensation and for time involvement and other things like this. And so I think my answer to the question that Glenna had originally asked was that you just have to stay in constant contact with both the community and the funder. And when these priorities change and the nature of the project, if it's significant in any way, also changes, then of course we have to make sure that the funders are willing to support, financially speaking, the change that occurs. And it's also important to remember too, that when we make such changes that we have to make sure that the ethics overview from the IRB is that the IRB is also informed of these changes and approves of it. So it's not only a money issue, but it's also an ethics review issue. And so those are just two parts of the three. The third part, of course, being the community. And if the community is initiating the project change, then we should make every effort possible to make that change, especially if it doesn't change the nature of the research or doesn't threaten the viability of that research. And if it does, then we need to be open about it, both to the community and to the funder themselves, and try to find a way to compromise, because the only way forward, of course, is consensus. And it should be. In other words, everybody agrees that this is the solution that will work. And that's been my experience with funding regarding this sort of thing. When a community, I worked for some time with the Division of Subsistence and the Department of Fish and Game, and it was much easier there because it wasn't funding coming in from an outside source, but instead from Fish and Game or Fish and Wildlife. And if a community decided they didn't want to participate, I always just thanked them and came back to Fairbanks and started to redesign and renegotiation. And so I think that really, most people understand that things aren't written in stone and do need to be flexible. And increasingly over time, at least in my time working with funding agencies since the 1990s, I've found that increasingly they're willing to be willing to make changes and make exceptions and to facilitate community interests. And I think that that's a really great step forward. Thanks, Margaret, and everybody. Thanks.
So at the risk of being a wet blanket on this, oh, sorry, Anika, did you want to go ahead?
I would have brought up something else, so go ahead, Henry.
My experiences have been generally like Mike's with agencies like NSF. There are other agencies and other funders that are far less forgiving and a lot more rigid. And so what I would say is pay very close attention to the way that you describe what your plans in your proposal, and to what the agency is willing to do. NSF is great. As long as it's intellectually related, you can do whatever you want. I mean, what on earth isn't intellectually related? So that's pretty much a green light to do much of anything. We had a case with another agency where we were documenting indigenous knowledge about marine mammals. We had listed the types of knowledge, types of topics that we expected to talk about. I can't remember, habitat and migrations and behavior and this kind of thing. And we then wrote our report, which we based on what people actually said. And the agency sent it back to us and said, no good. Your proposal said these were the headings. Those are the headings we expect, so stick with it. I mean, utterly ridiculous in terms of not reflecting what actually happened, but in terms of the agency point of view and that program officer, and perhaps the way we'd written the proposal, we had apparently locked ourselves into something and they were not going to budge. Not a big deal. We could redo it. It was okay, but still really irritating that the bureaucratic procedure, that what the proposal had said, that overruled whatever anybody in the community had actually told us and what they thought were the important topics. So just beware and be careful. Like Mike said, I mean, I think we could have perhaps pushed a little bit harder. If this was a bigger deal, we might have. But yeah, worth being aware of that from start to finish, even as you're writing the proposal.
Anika, I know you wanted to chime in next. Was it on the same topic about shifting course with research, or?
No, so go ahead if you do.
Yeah, maybe just to chime in, and I know Margaret and Henry and others were involved in a letter to NSF, and I had put in the chat a link to find the Coeric Bering Sea Tribe Rural Organization letter to NSF about a big program that was stood up, Navigating the New Arctic, that really didn't center Indigenous sovereignty. It didn't center Indigenous, knowledge co-production in it. And so the sort of, I guess the kind of institutional allyship, right? When there are large programs being put forth that really need to shift course, the sort of allyship across our institutions of power that can help put pressure on organizations to change course in a bigger way rather than just the individual PIs. And so I think that example is a good one of where allyship is needed to make sure funders are getting the message of kind of how to be doing this work in a good way, and centering Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous self-determination for research. And not sort of, a kind of blanket ticket to here's some money, research money, go do some stuff. I wanted to say with regard to the Navigating the New Arctic program, Dr. Jessica Black, Dr. Peter Wesley, Dr. South Danielson and I, some other collaborators, had a planning grant through that program and really shifted course because we felt that our community and tribal partner was being inundated with all sorts of research. And so that was, I think, again, not a decision. It would have been unethical to proceed, with something that was planned that became untenable or a burden for a tribal partner. And so being able to make sure you recognize that. And yeah, so anyway, thank you. Anika, I'll turn to you.
Thanks. I actually, when I listen to you, I think an important additional aspect. So we've talked a lot about how do you support communities if you go out to communities, do research. And I was also thinking that a really important aspect is, well, if you say you are, like a modeler and you're sitting in Fairbanks in front of your computer, and you can still really support, the change action. And so how do you do that? Like, how do you, how can you be a supporter? And so I think just switching, sort of the conversation to like a different perspective, like what are the different ways of how you can support when you do not go out and work with communities directly. Like we've talked about tokenization, we've talked about mentorship is a big one of students. I'm bringing in the student perspective here, but sort of supporting minority colleagues from minorities, the BIPOC background as students, faculty, and staff. So, like a whole, say, even within your institution, like how do you bring about change and how do you support the system change within, even like your micro universe of where you work and what you do. So I was thinking that is just such a different big topic that's also really close to home, especially as a student. We were trying to, Margaret was saying, I'm in the GIDI group, and we get all these questions of how do I do this? How do I bring in a more diverse student body, or how can we support hires to have a more diverse faculty, or in a more professional setting, how do I support, how do I do things? And so I thought when I sort of got thinking about all of these things, it was a really long process. And so I thought I'd share sort of my personal experience of the many drawbacks and the many mistakes you make and the constant learning that you go through. And so I'd encourage everyone to not be discouraged and not to, there's so many things you can do wrong and that you will do wrong. And I think you should try to minimize, of course, all of those. But it was a hard process for me, and it still is, to learn and to speak out about it and to be like, what can you do? And I think I make a lot of mistakes, and maybe even speaking here is a mistake, I don't know. But so it's just always a process of what can I do and how can I do it, and what is needed. So like a constant process of staying informed and talking to people, informing yourself and learning. So I'd really encourage everyone to not be discouraged, but to really think differently too. Like if you go into the field as a student or as a, how can we create a safe environment, a respectful environment just from field code of conduct, or how can we at my institution make it a welcoming place so that we actually retain faculty or students from a different background. There's a whole slew of topics that I think I'd really encourage everyone to look into and to think outside the box, to really you can there's a lot of things that would create a lot of momentum and change, and even just the naming of buildings here at UAF, or there's a whole lot of issues that I'd invite maybe the panel to talk to since we have a very diverse audience. Thank you.
I just want to follow up very briefly on one other aspect of the research work, is that it is really on the burden of the researcher to know the breadth and depth of research that has been conducted within a tribal community with a tribal government. That shouldn't be the burden of the tribe, who's most likely suffering research fatigue, which we already discussed, Henry and Courtney, at the top of the hour. But I've suggested this many times at UAF, and I was told that researchers want no more hoops to jump through, that we should have a collaborative database that outlines at minimum, who here within the UA system is conducting research with whom and where. And the researcher sitting next to me was like, yes, please, because I just went to a tribal community and a group of researchers from UAF were there the week before. To be clear, that is not being a good ally, that is not being a good accomplice, and that is basically being extractive and using Indigenous communities to further your research protocols if you haven't done the work to even know which of your colleagues are doing work there. So that's a very, bottom line level of responsibility to quality research. And of course, that produces better work for everyone. And I just want to also address the other issue that came up, excuse me, and that Dr. Black raised. It's, what do you consider knowledge in this framing? And I have to say, I have the luxury, excuse me, everyone, of being bipartite. My name never has to be at the top of any paper or on any paper in any work. I can list the actual real authors who provided the real knowledge of the paper. And so this is a privilege of mine that should be a privilege of all researchers at the university, that when you are using the known life ways, the known lived experience and observations of tribal peoples, that they're the author, that their knowledge is paramount, because without it, the research does not exist. No matter what research it is, if you are in their place, in their traditional territories that they've stored for over 10,000 years, that acknowledgement of knowledge should not be token.
So I'd like to follow up on that and what Anika was saying. So Anika, you were sort of asking the question of what can we do? I'd like to suggest the answer is all of that. And it's very tempting in these sort of situations to think, well, what we need is the key that will solve everything and address centuries of colonization and injustice and everything else. Once we turn the key, then poof, it all goes away and we're all happy. Ridiculous. There are lots and lots of different things, and these injustices are ingrained in so many ways. I was thinking, Carrie, of authorship, and I'm glad you raised that. Funding you've raised earlier, that's very important. Now, the question of who's speaking. Who goes to a conference? Is it me? Is it somebody else? How do we write a paper? I've written a few papers lately where instead of having me be the filter, I just say, here, write what you want to think, and I'll put in, it's got to go to an academic journal. I'll write the academic-y stuff with references at the beginning and the end. You write what you want to say and the way you want to say it, and we'll put it in there. No, I don't know. Is that an improvement? I'm not sure, but there are lots of different ways that we can try to make cracks in the system and address things. And I would just suggest we try to be as creative as possible. And the other thing is, as Carrie had said, and I think is a constant theme here, is the burden is on us to educate ourselves. Ignorance cannot be an excuse. Gee, I didn't know about past injustice. I didn't know what research had been done in your community. Really? You're going to write a proposal and say, I don't know anything about this field, but I want to write a proposal for nuclear physics, and the burden is on you to teach me. Don't be ridiculous. Why is this any different?
Yeah, I'll just follow up with Henry. I mean, he's saying it bluntly, I mean, it is ridiculous. I mean, it needs to be said bluntly. You know, we need to be, like I've said in my classes before, brutally self-honest, and make sure we understand where we stand in relation to the community, to our knowledge about the community, to the past that it's research in that community in the past, the historical conditions of the past, the things that people have suffered through. I mean, all of these should be a part of the pre-research before the first word is sent to any funding agency or anything like this. And I think, you know, too, as far as ownership goes, it has to be established from the beginning that the research that occurs in a community is serving more than one purpose, and those purposes need to be delineated, and that the knowledge that's either passed on or created has to be in the ownership of the community itself. And I've been on the IRB, the Ethics Review Board at UAF since 2008. And as recently as a few years ago, we've seen researchers demand ownership of the knowledge that they've acquired in Alaska Native communities, and sole ownership, I should say, exclusive ownership. And this is simply unacceptable. This is continuing the colonial process of trying to find a way to control other people's knowledge traditions. And this is still colonialism. And so if we're really going to be a part of the solution as scholars, you know, we have to work against these sorts of behaviors and these sorts of, even if it's institutional expectations, we have to be willing to stand up to them. And I've always said that if we're working with Indigenous communities or with any community in which social injustice issues are a prevalent part of the experience, we have to always be ready and willing to stand up to the same institution who we work with, who pays our bill, who pays our salaries and so forth, if we have to assert what's right and to change the situation. Because like Carrie was saying, for years and years, for decades and decades, people who look like me and Henry largely took credit for knowledge and efforts and achievements and accomplishments from the Indigenous communities that weren't their own, and became famous off of them oftentimes. And so I think, you know, to be genuine, we have to be ready and willing to stand up to injustices, even if it jeopardizes our own jobs and our own careers, if we're going to be in this sort of an area of work and study and so forth. Because it's more than just academics, of course, it's also about social justice. And that means we need to be very, very acutely aware as to what has happened in the past and be ready to acknowledge it. Thank you.
I can chime in. I think we're getting close to the hour there, but yeah, one of the things we were thinking about in sort of our prep for this meeting was thinking about, yeah, this kind of concept of white saviorism and like, what is our role as allies in this? And certainly it's, I think, again, Carrie said it really well, of the centering of Indigenous self-determination, right? Indigenous people know what's best for Indigenous people. There shouldn't be any crossover of that line from white, you know, quote unquote experts proposing policy or thinking, kind of applying that implicit and explicit deficit model. I see this all the time in fisheries policy. The problems of fisheries access are the problem of the villages. It's a problem of the way people in communities organize. It's not a problem of the people making the rules. It's not a problem of the rules. So I think really inverting that and making sure that we understand moving forward in this justice-oriented work is that we are not occupying spaces to be delivering proclamations or solutions. We are removing ourselves and uplifting Indigenous or Black leaders to be making those decisions for their own people, for their own communities, with their own knowledge systems, you know, for their own ends. So I think that's another important piece of this to add in.
So we are at the top of the hour, and so I wanted to thank our panelists. I feel like we can go on for hours and hours. But I figured we could wrap up, and then maybe if there's some lingering questions in the chat, we can cover it. But I thought maybe a nice way to wrap it up is, are there any final kind of concepts or thoughts you wanted to contribute to the recording on the sense of allyship and research? Maybe stuff we haven't talked about yet that you want to just include.
Just wanted to say Basi again, Margaret and Anika, for your work and for hosting these dialogues, and that continue to push your own boundaries, to be uncomfortable, to learn new things, to ask hard questions, to read things you haven't read before, to be hollered at, to be yelled at. I was hollered at many times living with an elder who taught me a great deal in my own humility and learning. And so if you're being hollered at, that means that someone's willing to invest in you, to even take the time to correct you. So really take those opportunities to push yourself.
I kind of don't want to take up more space here, but I do want to just add, I think there's a lot of people that I work with in this work kind of on the fence, or not on the fence, but like a hunger and a desire to contribute and to learn, but also a kind of wanting to step out for fear. And so just wanting to put in a plug there that this work is so important, and it really takes all of us, and hoping folks are, even if you don't think this is directly relevant to your actual research, it is, no matter what field you're in, it absolutely is, like at the core, and leaning in, getting uncomfortable, being able to push to where you are on your path, just really wanting everyone to feel that this is their work, because it really is all of our work right now, and it's really important and really pressing.
Yeah, I guess then I'll just end by saying, kind of following up on what Courtney was saying, don't let the difficulties turn you away. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years, and it's never easy, and it's always rewarding. And, I've learned far, 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 far more from working cross-culturally and with Indigenous peoples in particularly than through any other action in my life. And so it's worth it. It's worth the energy. It's worth the focus. It's worth the mistakes. And it's worth messing up and being corrected, as Carrie was saying. Thank you.
And I just add to that implicit in all this, I'm not sure how many, if we've used this word or used it very often, but is humility, which is, yeah, we're not going to do this very well at first. We're going to mess up. Are we worth teaching, as Carrie said? Are we worth correcting? If so, take that as the vote of confidence it is that you're worth the time and effort, and keep up with the humility that, yeah, we're all going to struggle with this. We're all going to fall short of what we might want to do. We're all going to get it wrong at certain times. But what's the alternative? Do nothing? Mike said it's hard work. Yeah, and what worthwhile thing has ever not involved hard work? So dig in, be humble about it, and hopefully we have a different conversation in a few years' time.
Yeah, maybe I'll add that think outside the box, like allow yourself to be completely open, and like systems change, things change all the time. So yeah, be ready be open, yeah, for a change, and think differently, and allow yourself to, yeah, for that anxiety that it might bring, that change is always something that, yeah, is never easy, but be open for that, and a new feeling and new ways of thinking. And I think yeah, that's something that always has helped me, that change is never easy, but it's always worth it. Or yeah, that's kind of.
All right, well, thanks. So I don't know, some of you guys might have to drop off the panelists, but if there are any questions people want to put in the chat now, or if they want to unmute.
Thanks, everybody. I know that I have a student waiting for a 1 o'clock phone call. I
Right.
told him I might be a little bit late, but I should probably go at this time. And thanks for inviting me to the panel. Very good work to you, all of you, in fact, but thanks, Margaret and Anika. Thank you all.
Thanks, Mike. All right. I am going to stop the recording. Thank you. So I will send out the links that we shared in the chat and the email. Also, I'll be on the website when the recording is available and uploaded to our YouTube channel. All right, thanks.